Randy Blythe did not step onto the stage to be loved. He arrived like an impact, a throat-ripping scream, a body thrown into the crowd, and the gaze of someone who never promised safety. To many fans, he is the embodiment of metallic fury. But the moment you think you understand Randy Blythe, the story turns in another direction. An artist shaped by brutal discipline, razor-sharp intelligence, and scars that are not displayed on the skin. His talent was not born of cheap recklessness. It was forged through years of being lost, addiction, and the decision to save himself when everything seemed already too late. Randy does not merely sing about collapse. He has lived inside it. He stood back up with an iron will, replaced intoxication with uncompromising artistic labor, and turned the stage into a place of purification rather than escape. At that very paradox gives his music an uncommon weight, violent yet controlled, furious yet not blind. Then tragedy struck in a way no one could have foreseen. A European concert night, an accident, a death, and Randy Blythe went from artist to defendant, facing prison in a foreign land. The media screamed, public opinion split, and he chose silence, confrontation, and a refusal to compromise the truth. Few know that the months awaiting judgment stripped bare the deepest fear of a man accustomed to screaming before tens of thousands. This is not the story of a famous metal singer. It is the journey of a human being who passed through darkness, paid the price of fame, and learned to shoulder responsibility to the very end. What kept Randy Blythe standing when everything could have collapsed? And in this deafening world, what ultimately is the cost of honesty? Born on February 21, 1971, under the full name David Randall Blythe, he grew up in Richmond, Virginia, a place that offered little reason to believe art would ever clear an easy path forward. The city ran on labor, on schedules, on finishing one's assigned work before thinking about anything else. Blythe's childhood moved to that rhythm. There was no artistic family to guide him, no support system promising a future. Life presented itself as a sequence of tasks to be completed, and not as a story waiting to be told. Music entered quietly, not through classrooms, not through guitar heroes, and not through metal in the familiar sense. The first sounds that reached him were punk and hardcore, raw, direct, and unwilling to please. Sex Pistols and Bad Brains arrived like collisions, forcing the listener to react rather than sit comfortably. Blythe never liked the phrase, "looked up to." He acknowledges influence, but he does not place anyone on a pedestal. To him, music is something to engage with, to answer back to, not something to bow before and imitate. For that reason, he repeatedly pushed labels away. He never claimed to be a metalhead in the conventional sense, and he stated plainly that he does not listen to Megadeth. This was not a rejection of the genre, but a way of preserving his right to define his own path. Punk and hardcore did not teach him how to become an artist. They taught him how to doubt authority, doubt taste, and doubt even himself. His respect for major bands has always been held at a clear, deliberate distance. Motorhead and Slayer are mentioned as predecessors worth learning from, but not as icons to lean on. With Guar, the connection is more personal. He does not see them as teenage influences. He first saw them perform while already in college, but over time they became older brothers within the same musical world. Dave Brockie did not teach him through advice. He taught by example, living straight, refusing compromise, and never shrinking himself to fit anyone else's mold. Before music became a possible career, labor was already a daily reality. Blythe worked in kitchens, climbed rooftops, and took jobs that allowed no delay and left no room for long-lasting illusions. Those experiences laid the foundation for how he would later view art. Music is labor too. The person at the microphone is no different from the worker completing his task. There are no privileges. There are no shortcuts. Those years did not produce a finished artist. They produced something else. A person who does not believe in myths, who is not accustomed to relying on glory, and who keeps a constant margin of doubt toward himself. From Richmond, from punk and hardcore, from manual labor, Randy Blythe entered music not as a carefully prepared dream, but as a slowly forming path, one where every step carries weight, and nothing exists unless he is willing to carry it himself. In 1995, that path first led him into a band. At the time, Burn the Priest existed strictly on a regional level, operating within the rhythms of the punk and hardcore scene rather than the structure of a professional metal act. Shows took place around Virginia, New York, and Philadelphia, in warehouses, small clubs, familiar stages like CBGB, where audiences did not just come to listen, but returned, ran into one another again, and slowly formed a community close enough to recognize the same faces night after night. The name Burn the Priest did not travel far beyond that circuit. There was no media attention, no cross-country touring, and certainly no reach outside the United States. Looking back, Blythe has spoken about this plainly. The band had a loyal local following, but it never existed as a nationwide phenomenon. He has dismissed later stories about longtime fans in England or California, because at that point the band had never set foot in those places. Memories retold years later, in his view, often grow larger than reality, expanded by time and by what came afterward. In 1999, the album Burn the Priest was released under limited financial and technical conditions. The sound remained raw and immediate, clearly marked by hardcore influences in its rhythmic construction and song structures. There was no thick layer of production to smooth things out, no calculation aimed at market access. The recording functioned more like a slice of that moment than a product refined for presentation. Blythe's vocals at the time were still reactive and impulsive, shaped more by the energy of punk stages than by a clearly defined metal technique. Shows followed one another in exhaustion, travel happened in old vans, schedules were scattered, and pay was low. Music existed alongside day jobs, not yet separated into a path that could be clearly named. Later recollections of that period are often told with greater weight, but at their core were very specific days, small stages, rough sound, familiar faces, and a band returning again and again to play without knowing where it was headed. As performance evolved and self-definition shifted, the name itself came under reconsideration. Burn the Priest was too direct, almost speaking for everything before the music had a chance to begin. From posters or album covers alone, listeners could easily slot the band into a ready-made frame, extreme, anti-religious, associated with satanic or black metal imagery, and then hear the music through a preformed bias. The new name did not arrive as an abrupt pivot, but as an adjustment in how the band existed. Lamb of God did not declare what the band was, nor did it lead the listener to an immediate conclusion. It preserved just enough ambiguity to force a pause, to invite a question before a label could be applied. And in that pause, the music gained the chance to be heard rather than predefined. The shift to Lamb of God was not driven by shock value or a desire for attention, but by the wish to escape overly fast labeling. Blythe has noted that the change was not meant to reject the past, but to open a different space of recognition, one where the name no longer boxed the band in from the very first second. It was a conscious choice, especially in an environment where image often precedes sound. Rumors that the name change was caused by bans or blacklisting surfaced early and persisted for years. Blythe has rejected them. Burn the Priest was not systematically shut out, nor excluded from venues in any organized way. After the switch to Lamb of God, some locations still refused to host shows, but only sporadically, not as a campaign, not on a scale large enough to drive the decision. The new name gradually reappeared on posters, tickets, and album covers, eventually becoming a familiar part of the band's life. It did not produce an immediate leap in fame, nor did it transform stage sizes overnight. But over time, the way people spoke about the band began to change. No longer reacting instantly to a provocative name, but waiting to see what stood behind it. In that waiting space, the music was allowed to stand on its own, without being explained in advance. The studio door closed and the clock began to run. Randy Blythe stood in front of the microphone with a fixed time allotment. 8 hours to record all the vocals in a single day. No long warm-ups, no multiple returns. The schedule was packed. Another session was already waiting outside. He arrived after a string of consecutive shows, his throat hoarse, and his body short on sleep, his breath still carrying the smell of alcohol. A glass of water at the base of the mic stand emptied gradually, song by song. The track rolled. He growled the opening line, held his breath through the section, paused for a few seconds, then continued. Time passed in takes, straight and dry, with no break long enough for the voice to recover. At times, the voice locked into the drum pattern, holding its force through the end of a song. At other moments, it ran out of air, and he had to push the remainder through sheer throat strength. Each line was almost preserved exactly as it emerged. No polishing, no heavy fixing. The limits of the recording were the limits of the body standing in front of the microphone. The sealed room held him in the same position, repeating the same motion until the voice wore down. Stage reflex went straight into the recording. Strained, explosive, occasionally slipping off time and then pulling itself back with whatever force remained. There was no distance between the performing person and the recording person. Everything happened on the same day, in the same throat. In the days that followed, he stepped back onto the stage with the very voice that had gone through that session. Between recording and performing, there was no clear boundary. The voice kept working night after night. Before showtime, he stood behind the curtain, practicing breathing, conserving strength at the beginning so he could last through the set. The pre-show drink grew less frequent. No declarations, just adjustments to keep the voice from breaking halfway through. New American gospel was born under those conditions. It was not built to be a leap forward, but simply as a record of a state in progress, tired, tense, raw, and direct. The album was received within metal and hardcore communities, but it remained within a specialized audience. Crowds grew, but the stages were still small clubs and halls. Touring stretched on, vans drove through the night, and the studio became a brief stop between two journeys. He toured while learning how to preserve his voice. Longer breathing exercises, less drinking before singing. Watching how he positioned himself at the mic so he wouldn't burn his strength too early. There was no announced turning point, just a series of small adjustments to keep pace with an increasingly compressed schedule. When it came time to record As the Palaces Burn, he stood longer in front of the microphone before each line. He reread the lyrics, set his breathing, then delivered the vocal. The music was still loud, time was still tight, but the working method had changed. He no longer lunged at every line on first impulse. Some passages were taken down a notch to preserve clarity. Others involved holding the breath longer before pushing upward. Takes ran longer, fewer had to be redone. What he was writing at this point did not turn inward toward personal life. Images of war appeared directly in the lyrics. No domestic metaphors, no borrowed personal stories to speak indirectly. There aren't any palaces in Indiana. The line followed him into the studio. After each section, he paused, looked down at the lyric sheet, then continued recording. The positions of the writer and the singer began to align more clearly. Looking back later, Blythe spoke plainly about not being seasoned in the early phase. He wasn't accustomed to the studio, didn't yet know how to conserve energy, couldn't fully control his voice when recording continuously for hours. New American gospel therefore retains the marks of the conditions under which it was made: rushed, tense, unfinished. As the palace's burn did not make the voice smoother, but it forced him to work more consciously with every line and every breath. The response after release changed as well. After shows, audiences asked about the lyrics. Journalists asked about war, about the imagery in the songs. He listened, answered briefly, then stepped on stage again the next night. No grand statements, no self-assigned role as a spokesperson, just standing with what he had written and singing it again each evening. 2 albums followed one another within a short span, and the work did not allow for a pause between them. The voice had to keep up with the schedule. The body had to keep up with the voice. The person at the microphone had to keep up with the very words he had put down. There was no milestone marking maturity. Only time closing in, forcing everything to operate faster than previous limits, and forcing change to happen while the work was still in motion. In 2004, the band stepped into a space far larger than anything they had known before. Ashes of the Wake was released through a major label system, bringing with it wide distribution networks, press attention, denser touring schedules, and expanded stages. For the first time, Randy Blythe was no longer standing only in clubs or small halls, but in venues where the lights were strong enough for both his face and his words to be magnified at once. The music did not change abruptly. What he wrote still followed the images that had appeared earlier: war, violence, and the consequences falling on people without the power to decide. This time, however, the external context shifted. The Iraq War, the Bush presidency, media and politics flooding into everyday life. When the album was released, those lyrics were immediately framed as political. Not because the content was new, but because the audience was broader. What had once existed within the metal community now moved straight outward, reaching people who had never heard the band before. The album entered the Billboard 200 in its first week. Shows that followed grew crowded quickly. The audience was no longer made up of familiar faces. Many came for the music, some out of curiosity, and others because of the debate surrounding the lyrics. Over time, the album was certified gold in the United States. Numbers began to appear alongside the band's name, something that had previously played little role in how they viewed their work. Backstage, the feeling of being seen changed noticeably. During the Republican National Convention in New York, the city was under heavy security. Snipers stood on rooftops. Down on the streets, Randy Blythe's face appeared on posters, flyers, hastily printed images, pasted everywhere. He walked through the crowd wearing an anti-Bush shirt, not on stage, not holding a microphone, just a person moving through a city while his name was being mentioned in many places at once. There were no major statements, no declarations to the press, but that moment marked a very specific shift. The lyrics were no longer confined to the musical space. They had entered a context where everything could be read in multiple directions. People asked about positions, about war, about specific lines. He listened, answered briefly, and moved on. The next night, he stood in front of the microphone again, singing those same lyrics to a larger crowd. Bigger lights did not change the music, but they changed how it was perceived. From that point on, Randy Blythe was not only standing in a touring band, but in a position where every lyric could be lifted off the stage, carried outward, and exist on its own terms. After Ashes of the Wake, the pace of work did not slow. Tours stretched across continents, interrupted only by short windows to write and record. The studio was no longer a carefully prepared space. but more like a mandatory stop between two drives. Randy Blythe entered Sacrament with a body already accustomed to constant operation, a throat perpetually at work, ears used to loud drums, and a mind juggling touring schedules, interviews, travel, and recording at the same time. Before each take, he stood still for a few minutes in front of the microphone, reread the lyrics, and slowed his breathing, and only then began to sing. No more charging in on pure stage reflex. Lines were held tighter, words clearer, but the force stayed compressed inside. When the music stopped, he did not step away immediately. He looked down at the lyric sheet, adjusted a line, then signaled to record again. Redneck took shape in that state. The song did not only point outward, it turned back toward the writer himself, how he saw his own background, how he was placed into ready-made labels, and how internal frictions accumulated without being spoken aloud. When the song received a Grammy nomination in 2007, the backstage atmosphere shifted noticeably. The band's name appeared within a different system than the metal scene they had come up through. More interviews, more scrutiny, questions centered on the song's content, on Blythe himself. He answered briefly, then stopped. He did not elaborate on the conflicts, did not build a narrative behind them. What belonged to the band stayed behind closed doors. The tours following Sacrament were longer and denser than before. Cities linked into chains, show after show. After each night, the Blythe stepped off stage with a burning throat and an exhausted body, sat down in the dressing room, took off his shirt, wiped away sweat, and drank. Alcohol appeared more regularly, before sleep, before getting on the bus, sometimes even before showtime. Sleep was shallow, mornings came early, and then the routine resumed. The body adapted by enduring. By the time Wrath was recorded, the band occupied a different position. The album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200 and topped the charts in Canada. Those numbers did not appear on stage, but they changed how everything operated. Larger crews, tighter touring schedules, higher expectations with each release. Recording sessions ran longer, more detailed. Blythe kept his voice compressed and low, directing force precisely rather than unleashing it all at once. Each take had fewer mistakes. But after each recording day, the wear on his throat was unmistakable. That same year, Wrath was awarded Album of the Year at the Metal Hammer Golden Gods. The awards night passed quickly. Lights, applause, a few brief remarks. The next morning, the band was back on the road. Success left no pause to be absorbed. It flowed straight into the next working schedule. Inside the band, tension did not erupt into a single defining incident. It accumulated with the rhythm of work. Small disagreements in the studio, silence on the bus, brief looks exchanged after shows. Ego surfaced not through loud words, but in the way each person maintained distance. Blythe chose not to go into detail. When asked, he stopped at the bare minimum, then shifted the conversation elsewhere. What happened between the members was left behind closed doors. During that time, alcohol became a familiar part of daily life, and not as an image of rebellion, but as a parallel rhythm to the work itself. Drinking to come down after shows, drinking to sleep, then getting back on the road. On stage, the energy remained tight and precise. Off stage, steps slowed, shoulders sagged, and the throat carried a constant dull ache after night upon night. Two rhythms existed at once, bright lights and the dark spaces without an audience. Success expanded stages, tours, and reputation. At the same time, it tightened the demands placed on the body to keep up. Blythe continued to stand at the microphone night after night, his voice thicker, heavier, carrying both the labor and the unspoken weight behind it. Within that pace, private life did not step onto the stage. His marriage was not folded into his image as an artist. He married Cindy, and the information stopped there. No public introduction, no story retold in the press, no repeated red carpet photographs. After shows, he returned to the hotel, his phone vibrating in his jacket pocket. He stepped out into the hallway to answer, spoke a few short sentences, then fell silent for a while. There was no big drama, just ordinary questions. Had you eaten? Where are you? What time is the flight tomorrow? The call ended. He stood there a moment longer before going back to his room. That separation gradually became a deliberate choice. As fame expanded, private life narrowed. What belonged to family did not travel with posters, did not live inside songs, did not become something for public consumption. He kept it outside the frame, the way a door is always closed before the lights come up. And between those two sides, one a stage in constant motion, the other a room no one sees, Blythe continued moving back and forth at his own pace. No declarations, no explanations. Just a man stepping out to sing each night, then returning to a place where he did not need to raise his voice. In 2010, Randy Blythe stopped drinking after many years of dependence. The decision happened quietly, without a public announcement or a staged milestone. He stopped when he realized his body and mind had reached their limit. In many later conversations, Blythe has spoken plainly. If he had continued drinking, he would have died. Not as exaggeration, but as a conclusion drawn from his condition at the time. He has never described sobriety as a victory. It was more like a condition for continued existence. Sobriety did not make life easier, but it created a different foundation. He worked, toured, and stood on stage without relying on substances to function. From that point on, the way he viewed personal responsibility, his own limits, and the world around him began to change in a tangible way. 2 years after he stopped drinking, Randy Blythe's life was suddenly pulled off its familiar course. In late June 2012, he was arrested in the Czech Republic immediately after landing at Prague airport to prepare for a tour. The arrest was connected to an incident that had occurred at a Lamb of God show there 2 years earlier, when a fan named Daniel Nosek fell from the stage and later died from head injuries. Blythe was charged with manslaughter and held in custody during the investigation. Alone in a foreign country, within a legal system he did not know. The days inside the cell carried none of the sounds he was used to. No drums, no strings, no rhythm to hold on to. He woke up, sat down, then stood up in the same space, repeating movements that led nowhere. At times he placed a hand on his throat out of old reflex, as if preparing to step onto a stage. But there was no microphone, no crowd, no lyric to be released. Time moved so slowly it could no longer be measured in hours. There was only the sensation of being there and of being unable to step outside through any sound at all. He denied intentionally causing the death, but he did not choose to retreat from or evade the legal process. After being released on bail, Blythe returned to the Czech Republic to attend the trial, a decision rooted more in personal conviction than public image. In the courtroom, the judge addressed the defendant directly. Blythe chose to answer. He said he had nothing to hide and was willing to face what had happened, whatever the outcome might be. In March 2013, the court ruled that Blythe bore moral responsibility for pushing a fan off the stage, but did not carry criminal liability. Most of the fault was assigned to organizational failures and security conditions at the show. The acquittal was upheld after the prosecution appealed. The case closed on paper, but its impact did not end with the verdict. The months of detention abroad and the prolonged waiting between court sessions and the uncertainty about the future left deep marks on Blythe's inner life. When he later looked back on this period, he spoke little about legal details and instead about silence. Not silence as avoidance, but as a pause that forced him to confront responsibility, his own limits, and events that could not be undone. While he was incarcerated on July 7, 2012, a vigil was held in Richmond to express support. Dave Brockie, the frontman of GWAR, stood up and spoke to the crowd. Footage of the gathering still exists. Blythe later said that watching it breaks my heart. At that time, he was far away, in another country, and for the first time realized that support still existed beyond the prison walls. Dave Brockie died in 2014. For Blythe, the loss was deeply personal. More than a colleague within the same music scene, Brockie was a predecessor, a point of reference shaped by a way of living honestly and without compromise. The image of Brockie standing up to speak while Blythe was absent became inseparable from the memory of that turbulent period. Brockie's death did not produce a loud shock, but left behind a persistent, aching void. And it became tied to the time when Blythe was learning to look back at himself, to accept responsibility for what had happened, and for what could not be reversed. Someone who had witnessed him through his greatest upheaval was no longer there. Alcohol dependence, sobriety, arrest, trial, and the loss of a deeply influential figure did not form separate chapters. They overlapped and flowed into one another, forcing Blythe to adjust how he existed over time. There was no single moment that could be named as a turning point. Only a sequence of experiences that slowed him down, sharpened his sense of responsibility, and compelled him to keep moving forward when there was nothing left behind him to provide cover. Not every trace a person leaves behind reveals itself through grand moments or emphatic declarations. With Randy Blythe, what remains lies in the way he moves through work and life without trying to make himself the center of the story. It accumulates through repetition, through how he shows up, does his part, and then steps back without needing to hold the gaze any longer than necessary. After shows, he often stays a little while longer. He doesn't rush to sign autographs, nor does he leave the moment the room thins out. He talks, asks questions, listens. Some people recall that Blythe doesn't begin with music, but with ordinary questions. What are you reading? What do you do when you're not listening to music? Why are you here tonight? The conversations aren't long, and they don't arrive at clear conclusions. But they're enough for the other person to remember the feeling of being seen as a human being, not just part of a crowd. Within the band, his role is rarely named through big statements. There are no moments where he steps forward to claim credit or explain on behalf of others. But over the years, those who work with him have grown accustomed to a rhythm, being present, doing his part, and staying until the work is finished. Not loud, not emphasized. Just a way of working repeated long enough to become something everyone recognizes. The way he speaks about himself carries the same restraint. At times, he admits mistakes. At other times, he stops at a single sentence. He doesn't elaborate, doesn't try to soften the uncomfortable parts. Space is left for the listener to understand things in their own way. That doesn't earn universal agreement, but it creates a sense of candor that isn't constructed to win approval. For Blythe, music is not separate from the person behind it. The ferocity on stage runs alongside a disciplined life beyond it. There is no effort to turn emotion into something easily digestible, and no attempt to smooth rough edges to meet expectations. What appears retains its rawness, and the listener decides whether to stay or not. Over time, memories of him don't form around a single moment. They come from brief encounters, short conversations, long work days carried through to the end. Not enough to build a myth, but enough to create the sense of a real person living and working in the same world as those around him. In the present, Randy Blythe still lives in Richmond, Virginia, the city where everything began. He continues to work with Lamb of God, recording, touring, maintaining the steady rhythm of a band that has moved through decades. His schedule revolves around studios, stages, rehearsals, and then returns to everyday life. There are no signs of withdrawal and no effort to reinvent his image to hold attention. The sobriety he adopted after 2010 remains an operating principle. Blythe doesn't talk much about it, but his rhythm of life makes it visible. Writing, photography, training, moving with the touring schedule, then returning home. These activities don't exist apart from music, nor do they become a new public image. They exist as a parallel life, keeping time for him when he's not on stage. And the way he appears in public hasn't changed much either. Still a direct voice, short answers, sometimes stopping before explaining everything. No attempt to control how others understand him, and no added layers of protection around a personal image. His presence feels like that of someone continuing to work within the craft he chose, rather than someone trying to preserve a position. Looking back across the entire journey, what emerges is not a straight line from hardship to success and then an ending. It's a chain of experiences linked together: manual labor, music, dependence, sobriety, legal upheaval, personal loss, and then continuing to work. No single segment stands alone long enough to become the center. Everything overlaps, forcing him to adjust how he lives at each stage. At the end of that arc, the story doesn't rest on what Randy Blythe has achieved, but on how he keeps moving forward after each moment of having to look back at himself. Not as a model, and not as a warning. Just a person holding on to his work, holding on to his rhythm of life, and carrying everything he has lived through. The dressing room door closes. Outside, the crew is still breaking down the stage, at the sound of cartwheels scraping across concrete, stretching in short intervals. Inside, he sits down, unscrews the cap of a water bottle, takes a sip, and sets it back. There is no closing statement. Just a man who has finished his part of the work, sitting quietly long enough to need no further explanation.